Welcome to this explainer. Look, if there's one topic that is virtually guaranteed to dominate the headlines and spark some intense debates right now, it's non-citizen voting in the United States. It's a complex landscape, to put it mildly. But today, we're cutting straight through the noise. We're going to dive right into the hard data, the actual laws on the books, and the historical context that's actively shaping this issue. Let's get right into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the demographic reality, the federal baseline, local voting exceptions, state constitutional bans, and finally wrap up with the ongoing debate. Starting off with Section 1, the demographic reality, defining the U.S. non-citizen population. To really understand this, we need to look at the numbers. According to the Pew Research Center, as of 2023, there were over 28 million non-citizens living in the U.S. Now, how does that actually break down? Well, it's basically three main groups. You've got 11.9 million permanent legal residents. These are folks with green cards who live and work here permanently. Then you have about 2.1 million temporary legal residents, so think international students or temporary foreign workers. And finally, roughly 14 million immigrants living in the U.S. without legal permission. Getting a handle on these distinct groups is absolutely crucial because it tells us exactly who these various voting laws actually impact. Moving right along to Section 2, the federal baseline, the laws governing national elections. Let's rewind a bit to the year 1996. That's when the U.S. Congress passed a definitive hardline law that explicitly prohibits non-citizens from voting in any federal elections. So, regardless of whether someone has a green card, a student visa, or no legal status at all, they absolutely cannot vote for the U.S. House, the Senate, or the presidency. Period. This federal baseline is incredibly strict, it's absolute, and it applies nationwide. So, when we hear these passionate debates about non-citizen voting, it is super important to remember. Actually, scratch that. It's absolutely crucial to remember. We are not talking about these federal offices. That brings us to Section 3, local voting exceptions, where non-citizens can vote locally. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. Because our U.S. election system is highly decentralized, once you step past that federal level, you run into this fascinating total patchwork of laws. As of July 2026, the District of Columbia and specific municipalities within just 3 states, California, Maryland, and Vermont, are literally the only places in the entire country that allow non-citizens to vote in some or all local elections. And notice I said municipalities. This isn't some statewide rule in any of these places. It is strictly handled on a town-by-town, city-by-city basis. So what does this actually look like on the ground? We'll take San Francisco, for example. They allow non-citizen parents or legal guardians to vote, but only in school board elections. It's a hyper-targeted exception focused entirely on education. But then, up in New England, Vermont cities like Burlington authorized legal residents to vote in broader city elections. And honestly, what's wild about the Burlington case is that they actually passed this by overriding a gubernatorial veto. It just goes to show you how fiercely this whole issue is debated between local and state officials. Now, Maryland's situation is pretty unique. Their state constitution essentially gives municipalities the green light to decide their own voter qualifications without having to go ask for permission from the state capitol. Because of that localized power, you have at least 11 different towns and cities across Maryland, places like Tacoma Park and Hyattsville that actively permit local non-citizen voting right now. And then there's the District of Columbia, which has had a seriously complex journey trying to enact its own local voting exceptions. Since D.C. isn't a state, after they passed the Local Resident Voting Rights Act in late 2022, they had to sit through a mandatory congressional review period in early 2023. They cleared that hurdle, but immediately faced federal lawsuits from voters claiming the law diluted their rights. A district court dismissed that challenge in March 2024, but the whole thing went up to an appeals court with arguments heard in March 2025. It is an ongoing legal saga, for sure. Let's pivot now to Section 4, state constitutional bans, explicit prohibitions at the state level. In stark contrast to those hyperlocal municipal allowances we were just talking about, there's a much, much larger block of states taking aggressive action to stop this practice entirely. We're talking 18 states with explicit constitutional bans compared to just those 3 states with the small local carve-outs. As of July 2026, these 18 states have actually added explicit language directly into their state constitutions, absolutely prohibiting non-citizen voting in any state or local jurisdiction. By baking this right into their constitutions, they've basically slammed the door on any local mayor or city council trying to set up the kind of local laws we just saw in Maryland or Vermont. It's a massive, preemptive legal movement sweeping across huge chunks of the country.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 5, the ongoing debate, looking at the arguments for and against.
All right, let's break down the core arguments, keeping it completely impartial. On one side, those who support non-citizen voting really base their arguments on a few key pillars. They point out that non-citizens pay local taxes, and so, the argument goes, they deserve a say in how that money is spent. They also believe it creates much more responsive local policies, that a city simply runs better when everyone living there can participate. Plus, they bring up a pretty fascinating historical reality. From 1776 all the way to 1926, around 40 states actually allowed non-citizen voting at various levels of government.
Supporters also really lean into the human element of all this. Take this quote from Los Angeles City Council member Hugo Soto Martinez. He said, "After my parents immigrated here, they worked hard, paid taxes. They deserve a voice in our local government." The heart of this argument is all about community integration. The idea is that long-term community members who are contributing financially and socially should absolutely have a democratic voice in the everyday policies that affect their lives, things like local schools and infrastructure.
Now, on the flip side, opponents counter with three massive pillars of their own. First, they argue that allowing non-citizens to vote actively dilutes the voting power of American citizens. Second, they point to a major logistical and security red flag, blurring those eligibility lines. The big fear here is that having non-citizens on local voter rolls could inadvertently lead to illegal voting in state or federal elections, where, remember, they are strictly banned. And finally, there's the administrative headache. Opponents argue that building and running dual election systems, one ballot for citizens, another for non-citizens, is a massive, unfunded financial burden dropped right on local taxpayers. This perspective is deeply rooted in a strict interpretation of civic rights. Just look at how U.S. Representative August Pfluger put it. Non-citizen voting, whether it is 1 vote or 1 million votes, dilutes the voting power of the citizen voter. For opponents, this is pretty cut and dry. They fundamentally believe the right to vote is a sacred privilege, one that has to remain totally exclusive to legal citizenship, and that altering that baseline fundamentally damages the integrity of our elections. Ultimately, what we have here is a profound clash of perspectives. Organizations like the ACLU look at these local enfranchisement laws and see a path to stronger, more transparent, and more accountable communities. But on the other side, institutions like the Center for Immigration Studies look at those exact same laws and see a direct threat to election security. They warn that even at the local municipal level, these measures erode public trust and open up dangerous loopholes for potential voter fraud. It is a fundamental, bedrock disagreement on what actually secures and strengthens a democracy. As demographic realities continue to shift across the country, we are left with a pretty massive question. Will these hyper-local exceptions for non-citizen voting spread into new cities and towns, or will strict state constitutional bans ultimately become the national standard? Which vision of representation is going to shape the future of the American ballot box? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.